Hi BookTube, and welcome to a non-fiction review. In the 3 years that I've been on BookTube, I've read a couple of works and reviewed a couple of works about natural history, but they've mainly focused on animals and birds. I felt I should broaden myself a bit and look into a topic that used to fascinate me when I was very young in the 1970s, but that was before the science had caught up with the reality. And I'm talking about volcanoes, and the book that we're going to look at today talks about the deadliest eruption in recent history. The book we're reviewing today is Krakatoa, The Day the World Exploded, August 27th, 1883, by Simon Winchester. That was published in 2004, 448 pages, of which 367 are the text. This was a Kindle ebook that I purchased in June 2023 because I already knew Simon Winchester, and we're going to get into that more. We might as well go on now and talk about the author. Simon Winchester was born in 1944 in London. He studied geology initially at St. Catherine's College at Oxford University. He graduated in 1966 and he found work with Falcon Ridge Nickel Mines. That was a Canadian mining company, and his first assignment was to work as a field geologist looking for copper deposits in Uganda. Thank goodness he was a little dissatisfied with that work. While he was in Uganda, he read James Morris's account of the 1953 ascent of Everest, and it made him wish he could be a writer. And apparently he wrote to the author, to Morris, and Morris wrote back and advised him, get yourself a job in newspaper journalism, which is what Winchester did. He began working for the Guardian newspaper in 1969, and he went on eventually to work for the Sunday Times in 1982, and he was publishing books as he was working as a journalist. You'll see his first publication there in Holy Terror, reporting the Ulster Troubles, which is exactly what he was doing. And finally, by 1985, he'd built up enough of a reputation as an author that he could then go on and work freelance. His most recent work, The Breath of the Gods, The History and Future of the Wind, of course, goes back to his geology background. This is what I can say about Winchester's titles. They either deal with the current events he's covered while working as a journalist, or they're topics related to geology. There are a couple of exceptions. The first Simon Winchester book that I read was a history of the development of the Oxford English Dictionary, and I bought it on spec, and I found him the kind of writer where if you know nothing about a subject but you're vaguely curious, he has the ability to pull you in, give you all the facts you need to feel more grounded in that topic and without making you bored. And for that reason, I think he was probably awarded his OBE in 2006 for services to journalism and literature. I want to point everybody in the direction of his website. It's beautiful. It's worth a visit. The structure of the book, it begins with a prelude rather than an introduction, 6 pages, where Winchester just talks about his own fascination with Krakatoa and what finally brought him to the area to research the 1883 eruption. And then, of course, it goes on. There's 11 chapters, 33 pages per chapter. That might seem like a fair bit, and I can't comment on the text presentation, but I'm going to imagine that even though I read the Kindle edition and you might read a paperback, because of the number of illustrations which interrupt the text, I suspect that the paperback text is also single-spaced, just to keep the illustrations falling where they are supposed to in the book. Simon Winchester, I'll say this, he does have a fondness for long sentences, and he isn't afraid to give you new vocabulary. You'd expect that with a good nonfiction book. And yet somehow he manages a tone which is warmer and slightly more conversational than either textbook or academic writing. And I'm going to speculate on why this is. I think it's because his adjectives and adverbs are sometimes more exuberant, like on page 12, where he provides a definition for the term Plinian. And he says, a Plinian eruption is now defined as an almighty explosive eruption that all but destroys the entire volcano from which it emanates. Now, I think a textbook editor would put a red pen through the word almighty and choose a term that was more textbook-like, or be more specific about exactly how much destruction is necessary. But I liked the insertion of this word almighty. I could imagine it being spoken. It gave a storyteller's coloring to that sentence, which would otherwise have been a very dry definition. And also, there's another example further along that page where Winchester says, the 17th century traders were there for pepper, because the passion for pepper seemed to burn like a flame of love in the breast of Dutch and English adventurers, burn like a flame of love, while giving a history of the early modern spice trade. That's Simon Winchester's style. You'll also see there's plenty of resources in the book. Not a long bibliography, though. It's really just a list of recommended books, and Winchester also notes a warning that there are some books you might not want to read simply because the level of detail with which they describe the eruption might be disturbing for some. I'm going to ask myself a couple of questions which will help give you a sense of what's inside. I'm going to ask myself, what was the most surprising thing that I learned from this book? And to be brutally honest, almost everything that Winchester had to say was new knowledge to me. For example, I didn't know exactly where to locate Krakatoa. That's embarrassing, isn't it? I knew it was somewhere in Southeast Asia, and I also didn't know anything about the Dutch colonial expansion into that area. I'll put a map on screen in case you also are thinking, well, I don't know either. Help me here. This is the general area, and you'll see I've circled where Krakatoa would be, but on the island below that, the island of Java, I didn't know that Jakarta used to be called Batavia, and it was the global capital, if you like, of the Dutch East Indies trading. Back in the 1970s, this is to go on to geology, I owned a little paperback children's book about volcanoes, but the information in it, I now realize, was completely revised in my lifetime because the building up of evidence for the movement of continental plates, that was not really solidified amongst scientists until the early 70s and accepted as conclusive. And also, I didn't know about the 19th century meteorologist who first suggested that the Earth's surface was composed of moving plates, and I didn't know that when he presented this evidence, he was derided and disrespected by all his contemporaries. And that was Alfred Russel Wallace, a man who I think he deserves more credit than he gets for his discoveries. I think if it weren't for his propensity for sharing too much with his colleagues, he would have been the first person to publish a theory of natural selection, and we would be talking about Wallace's theory of evolution instead of Darwin's. In fact, what I have put on my to-do list is to read a good biography of Russell's. One of his discoveries fascinated me, and I'd like to read a passage from the Kindle book now, starting on page 54. Alfred Russel Wallace, who at the time was collecting, studying, and living on the spice-rich island of Ternate in a grass hut, would take the observations of this young naturalist, this is talking about Sclater, and adding a vast amount of information from his own observations and collections, transform them into a theory and a grand cartographic creation that would survive to this very day. It has a name that remains its architect's most famous memorial, the Wallace Line. In 1854, Wallace set off alone for the East Indies, the chain of islands that he, as a geographer, preferred to call the Malay Archipelago, since the thousands of islands were indeed a classic example of an archipelago. And the island's lingua franca was, in most cases to a greater or lesser degree, based on Malay. His keen conviction remained for all the 8 years that he spent there, that evidence to be found in this archipelago would substantiate his two growing beliefs, that geography was highly influential in the development of biology, and that species originated by the natural selection of favored types from within the variations of any population. He spent the better part of his life seeking to prove both points. His study of this vast number of living things brought him to both of the epiphanies that he had sought, and at almost the same moment, he suddenly realized evolution's existence and mechanism, and he immediately recognized the profound difference between the two basic animal and plant populations of his chosen archipelago. Certain birds, say parrots, found in wild abundance in the eastern Australian end of the archipelago, were quite literally rare aves on the western Indian side. There are barely any parrots on Java, but there is every imaginable kind in Sulawesi and Timor. Not a single cockatoo is to be found in the West, but two entire families each of cockatoos and lories, this last a kind of parrot with a brush-like tongue, are found in the East. Barely any thrushes are to be found on the islands to the east of Bali. In the western half of the archipelago, there are woodpeckers, barbets, trogons, paradise flycatchers, and paradise shrikes, minivets, blue drongos, pheasants, and jungle fowl, but none of these, just like the humble thrush, is to be found in the east. The forests of this eastern end of the chain, on the other hand, are populated uniquely with legions of showy and exotic birds that one might just as easily find in Queensland and New South Wales. Honeysuckers and birds of paradise, cassowaries and emus. Any traveler with half an eye and half an ear open will realize simply from the colors and the bird song that something profound is going on in making an eastward journey from Sumatra to Irian. Though he may not once pass out of sight of land, the traveler will have most decidedly left one world and entered another one utterly different. And it was this discovery of a line that divided the biota of these islands that are so close together that there's no reason for them to have such different species, except that the land masses that were now close together had at some point, when the life forms were developing, been further apart. That was the only explanation. It was that line, the discovery of that separateness of these biota, that began the thinking that the continent must have been made up of pieces which had moved together over time. And so this is all the stuff that I learned. And there was more. There was also the political subject of what happened to the area after the eruption, because there had already been unsettledness amongst those who were indigenous to the islands against their Dutch colonial masters. But after the eruption, that political instability simply increased. The eruption seemed to be justification for social change because there had been so much natural change and natural damage. And Simon Winchester is the kind of person I would choose if I'm going to head into a new topic, because I remembered how he would make sure that every reader was thoroughly grounded, not just in the main subject of his book, not just in we're talking about the volcano itself. You'll notice that I've talked all around the business of the volcano. And he does that. He creates in you a kind of a multidisciplinary knowledge, which all contributes to your knowledge of the main subject itself. And you always feel that you come by this without it feeling like an onerous, dry read. So you get a rich feed of information without that heavy, dull feeling that you sometimes get from textbooks. Winchester writes the way a textbook author might give an after-dinner speech. Does that make sense? Where, yes, they'll have lots of facts to hand because that's how well they know their subject, and you will learn something, but yet the occasion will seem lighter because the author will, by his choice of words, reveal his passion for the subject and pass on that enthusiasm. It's clear how much Winchester loves to study, loves to learn, and loves to pass on everything that he learns. And it's that excitement, I think, that when you see sentences that have those enthusiastic adjectives, you find yourself smiling while you are reading them. And so the next question that I'm going to ask myself, was there any knowledge you wish you had before you started this book to appreciate it better? I'm going to say no. No, I didn't need to. Winchester is not expecting a specialist audience to come to this book. His journalism experience makes him infinitely curious and eager to explain. He does not mention something in passing and just assume that his readers already know what he means, which can happen in more academic writing. And the descriptions of the fateful series of explosions that happened in August 1883, they were gripping and horrifying, as if I was reading a piece of a disaster novel. People had no idea. There was no historic precedent for what happened at Krakatoa, no early warnings. And so some people did wonder if the world was ending. And in my description box, you'll find a couple of links to videos which simulate the tsunami that followed the explosions, the final explosion, and that wave that moved south toward the northern coast of Java that was high enough to drown, to completely overwhelm whole towns. And it lifted ships out of the sea and carried them 1.5 to 2 miles inland and just dropped them down. There were lots of these amazing escape stories as well as stories of the destruction. And then the book closes and talks about the global impacts after that eruption. And I had an opportunity to feel smug. This is going to be a bit of a sideline, but let me explain. In 1980, on the 18th of May, I was still living in the Greater Vancouver area. That was an early Sunday morning, the 18th of May, and I had a track and field practice at 8 o'clock. My father drove me, and we went to a park with a track area, and he sat in the bleachers talking to all the other parents. I was down in the track area doing warm-up exercises, and most people remember hearing this bang. We thought it was a gunshot at first, so of course we looked around, but the car parked behind the bleachers. It was as quiet, everything was as Sunday morning quiet as you would imagine. So we thought, it must have been a car backfiring or something that we couldn't see because there was no commotion, no activity, and we just didn't know what it meant. And then after the track and field practice, I rode home with my father. I didn't drive. He did the driving. When we got home, we listened to the radio. There was some lunchtime news headlines, and they talked about the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which had happened that morning. And we put 2 and 2 together and thought, we must have heard that explosion. And yet there was something in Winchester's book when he was talking about eruptions generally, where he says, no one suggests that the explosion of Mount St. Helens in May 1980 was heard much beyond the very mountain ranges in which it was sighted. And I wanted to shout, no, we heard it up in Vancouver, several hundred miles away. But when I think about it, probably only a few of us did. It was that early on a Sunday morning that most people would have been indoors, possibly asleep, or just getting up and getting ready for the day. And so, we were one of the few people that happened to be outdoors in the open air. And I think we did hear the explosion from that far away. But that is a digression. Winchester does go into the plate tectonics and exactly how they were shifting and colliding at the point where the Krakatoa volcano was. So there's a lot of interesting material there about what was going on underneath the mountain. And it was, I can't praise the book highly enough. I found it fascinating. I would love to hear, though, if anybody who's watching this has a volcano-related experience like the one I've just talked about, or something closer to hand, Mount St. Helens or any of the other recent volcanic eruptions. It'd be great to hear if you wanted to leave something in the comments. And that's the review done. Middlemarch meditation fans, I know you were expecting another meditation. I am getting that ready for you. It's just that the scripts take longer. Reviews are quicker. So I thought if I was going to produce something for this weekend, it might be better to do a review. But I did read through chapter 30, and I think we're going to be able to do all of that in one episode. So look forward to that. In the meantime, I know there's been a lot of extreme weather, and so instead of my usual sign off, I'm going to just say to people, please look after yourselves and those that are near you, and I'll see you again in a few days' time. Bye-bye.